Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Happy Saturday, everybody. I hope you're having a restful weekend. Today's video will be focused on the growing trade and security tensions in the EU-China relationship. This is a critical bilateral relationship which we've been following closely in recent months. This week saw the Minister of Commerce, the PRC Minister of Commerce, Wang Wentao, in Europe on a charm offensive, though some may just call it an offensive, to try to stop EU tariffs on EV imports. At a meeting of the China-Spain Joint Economic and Industrial Cooperation Committee, while visiting Madrid, he expressed, quote, "It is not industrial production capacity that is excessive, but anxiety." End quote. He also noted that the accusation of market distortion against China was the result of a, quote, distorted mentality, end quote. This is part of a rhetorical cat-and-mouse game, which has been ongoing for some time now. The Europeans warned Beijing that they are concerned by overcapacity and that they will respond to it through policy if not addressed. Beijing's response is completely denying it. This refusal to even recognize EU concerns in the realm of trade will likely not help prevent the protectionist backlash winding up on the continent. And with China enjoying a massive surplus with Europe, they stand to lose much more in the event of a trade war. Indeed, EU officials told Chinese carmakers this week that the European Commission is expected to levy provisional duties on made-in-China electric vehicles from the 4th of July. For American officials keen to see the Europeans move into alignment with the US on their trade policy vis-à-vis China, they will be extra pleased to see these tariffs introduced on this date. An EU investigation into subsidies in China's EV industry has threatened to tear new ruptures in an already tense bilateral relationship. The Commission is expected to inform companies privately next week about the level of import duty that will be applied. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reports on counter-threats from Beijing. A 5-page letter mailed to the EU's trade chief threatened to go after EU aviation and food exports. On Wednesday of this week, the PRC Commerce Ministry issued another warning, quote, "If the EU does not practice what it preaches and continues to suppress Chinese companies, China will take all necessary measures to firmly safeguard the legitimate interests of Chinese companies." End quote. As we have seen for months now, both sides are very much talking past each other. These trade tensions look to be boiling into a full-blown trade war, which could affect hundreds of billions of dollars of goods and disrupt global supply chains. It wouldn't be an episode of China Update without a Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis quote, of course, so let's wrap up part 1 of today's video with comments he made this week, which nicely sum up the crux of the structural forces behind this conflict. Quote, "It is pretty clear to me that global trade conflict is likely only to get worse, mainly because the two sides cannot even agree on what the disagreement is about. China's commerce minister said in Spain that the EU has used overcapacity, unfair competition, and other false narratives to launch investigations into Chinese EVs, railway, solar, medical equipment, and other sectors, increasing the risk of China-EU frictions. These are not false narratives, except in the very limited way Beijing sees the dispute. China insists that the dispute is only about excess capacity in a narrow range of goods, and not about an overall growth strategy that requires China's share of global manufacturing, currently 31%, to rise twice as fast as its share of global GDP, 17%, and more than 3 times as fast as its share of global consumption, 13%. This would require a substantial and opposite accommodation from the rest of the world. The rest of the world, not surprisingly, refuses to accommodate China's growth strategy if it means undermining their own manufacturing and wants Beijing to resolve its weak domestic demand by implementing more aggressive fiscal policies to boost domestic consumption. But for China, that's easier said than done. Beijing has been talking about resolving its domestic demand deficiency since 2007, but cannot do so without a major transformation of its growth model and its governance institutions, something it has found too difficult. For now, Beijing is stuck with its need to expand its share of global manufacturing. The United States, India, and Japan clearly do not want to balance this expansion, and developing countries are too small. That's why European acquiescence is so important." End quote. Meanwhile, this week the first Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine visited Beijing to meet with Vice Foreign Minister Sun Weidong. The Deputy Foreign Minister told reporters after the meeting that he discussed the upcoming peace conference in Switzerland and hoped the PRC would attend, but the PRC readout of the meeting made no mention of the conference. State media has pushed back against criticism regarding China's decision not to participate in the Switzerland conference. State-run Global Times, for example, writes that, quote, "These countries are attempting to morally abduct China and tarnish its reputation. Some Western countries are only participating in the conference to assert their relevance and advance their own interests in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In contrast, China's commitment to justice and collaboration with global South nations to promote peace has garnered international recognition." End quote. This exchange came days after Zelensky's comments in Singapore about PRC support for Russia, a change in rhetoric which could have made things worse for EU-China relations. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post, in an article this week, reported that an unnamed senior European diplomat believed Zelensky's very strong intervention in particular would help loosen the tongues of some capitals who were previously reluctant to criticize China, citing Ukraine's close consul on the matter. Quote, "Now the gloves are off," end quote, they said. At the end of May, top Asia officials from a group of EU members met in Stockholm to discuss China. The consensus was Europe must, quote, "impose more cost on China for its support of Russia," end quote, according to a figure familiar with the discussion. And finally for today, Noah Barkin, a senior visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund and senior advisor at Rhodium Group, publishes an excellent monthly newsletter called Watching China in Europe. His most recent piece was published this week, and I wanted to end today's video by examining some of his thoughts from the piece. But just quickly, if you're enjoying today's episode of China Update and getting some value from it, it's a huge help if you can hit the like button. Subscribing is also a big help. Subscriber numbers are slowing down, but 45% of regular viewers are not subscribed, so if you can subscribe, it is a huge help, and sharing, of course, is a big help as well. The YouTube algorithm is not a big fan of this channel, so sharing is probably the only way in which this channel can continue to grow and be seen by new people. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below for those who want to help me keep the channel financially sustainable. Now, let's move into the Noah Barkin observations from this week. Observations that I think sum up two key points from today's episode. Quote, "Beijing is certainly betting that, when push comes to shove, it will be able to mine the deposits of strategic naivete that are still present in some European capitals. It is worth underlining here that since Scholz went to Beijing in mid-April, and she visited Emmanuel Macron in Paris in early May, the Chinese side has given the Europeans absolutely nothing on the issues they care about most: China's support for Russia's war machine, and the threat of cheap subsidized Chinese technologies flooding into the European market. It was striking that Ukraine's President Zelensky, who had shied away from open criticism of Beijing through more than 2 years of war, went off-piste in Singapore and accused China of actively undermining the very peace conference that Scholz and Macron had spent days trying to convince Xi to support. Berlin and Paris need to recognize that their efforts have failed and draw the proper conclusions. On trade, meanwhile, China's leadership has dismissed European concerns about industrial overcapacities as delusional, and lobbed one threat after another at EU member states. Konak, cars, agriculture, aeronautics, the list goes on, as part of a highly choreographed public campaign involving state media and business associations to convince the big capitals to push back against the Commission's EV case. A letter sent by China's Ministry of Commerce to EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis last month contained nothing new in terms of Chinese offers, but was littered with threats. "I was told, the Chinese are making the point that our German masters want us to negotiate," a senior EU official told me. "They think that by giving us a few peanuts, they can get the Germans on board," the same official told me. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you everybody for watching. Have a good Saturday, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.